Hello, this is Harpo. Welcome to my Pondlife series. Big hello to all my grandkids and my clanmates, especially Kate Down Under, who also started her own YouTube channel. I should get the link and post it in the notes. I have several ponds, and I wanted to go through and explain some of the things that was going on in my ponds. This is my main pond in my front yard. It was I just finished it this spring. It seems to be thriving very well. But that's not what I want to talk about today. What I'd like to talk about is some other ponds. Now, these are the ponds I wanted to talk about. What we've got going on here is I had the need to create an isolation tank because one of my goldfish koi got egg bound and actually delivered a couple of babies into the big pond, so I moved her here into the little pond, and I'll talk more about the egg-bound female. She's in the pond that's on the bottom of the screen. Um, what you see here is duckweed. The duckweed, what I call green duckweed, is in the top pond, and in the bottom pond is what I call red duckweed, but along with it, when I seeded it, was this sort of fern-like stuff I'll show in just a second. That seems to do pretty much better than the duckweed in the conditions I've got. I've also got a little bit of lizard tail there started in there. Now these tubs that I'm using, when I needed the isolation tank, I needed something relatively cheap, and I could go to a grocery store and probably get one for 60 bucks or a couple other alternatives, but I remembered in Lowe's and Home Depot they have concrete mixing tubs for about $10, and so that's what I went and got. They seem to be an ideal depth. The pots that I use to grow my plants in just barely peak above the top of the water, which is about 8 inches. And the bottom tank here is what I call my isolation tank, and it's got the egg-bound female in there in the fry, and quite a few fry now. And and the top tank was a tank that I seeded with some water from a local pond here, and it was a very small amount of water, which created both the duckweed and the sort of the fern-like stuff on the top. And they've been sitting here for about a month, and the green duckweed in the top container has done really well. The red duckweed, which I separated a few pieces out, and has grown, but this fern-like stuff, I don't know quite what it is, just seems to be growing much better, and I think it's because of the pH and the algae, and I'll explain that in a bit. And what you see in between sort of the green stuff is what I call the red duckweed. Now over here in the other tank, we have essentially a mix, which is mostly the green, the green duckweed. And they're quite a bit different. When you pick up some of this stuff, you'll notice that they have real long, probably about an inch long roots on them. And whereas if you go over and pick up some of the red duckweed, if it doesn't have fern on it, is generally much shorter roots. And this fern stuff seems to have quite a long root system as well, almost too well. And all this stuff tends to creep up on the hyacinth and the water lettuce that I've got in here. I've got those in here basically so that I can tell what the condition of the pond is in, and frankly neither one of these ponds are in great condition right now. I would expect, like you may have seen in the initial picture in the main pond, a nice dark green color. That's not happening, and I think that's why the pond on the left with the fern stuff is doing so well, is I think it thrives much better at a higher pH, whereas the duckweed wants much lower. Ideally I would like to keep my ponds at about 7.5 pH, which is where my main pond generally stays. These two ponds, because of red algae and string algae, not red algae, just algae and string algae, are pH cycling right now, which means as the algae and grow during the day, they actually raise the pH of the water. And then at night, the process reverses and it actually lowers the pH. And so before I got too concerned about what was going on here, you have to measure the pH at 6 o'clock in the morning and probably like 4 o'clock in the afternoon and look at the amount of swing. I'm principally concerned with how much pH is in the morning, and if it can get down to about 7.5, maybe up to 8, I'm pretty comfortable. Once the algae get in there and deplete the oxygen, the pH is going to go up, and then you've got problems. And because the pH is higher, I've got nutrient blockade going on, I think, with the duckweed. Generally, I would expect them to need a pH of about 7.5, maybe even a little bit lower, in order to unlock the nutrients. I believe in both tanks there's plenty of nutrients. It's just that the plants can't use them because they're locked up. It's out of the pH range. In addition to testing for pH, I'm also testing for total dissolved solids. And in this particular case, each of these two smaller ponds runs at about 175 total dissolved solids, which is about where my main tank runs. And yet my main tank gives a rich, green color to everything, and yet these here are barely surviving. If I take the total dissolved solids of the little lizard tail plant inside the pot, it's about 600 parts per million, principally because the soil I used there contained a good amount of horse manure. It came right from my garden. Thought I'd talk a little bit more about the goldfish I have here that I call the egg-bound goldfish. And what situation arose where my son said he thought that there were little fry swimming around in the big pond, and I necessarily didn't believe him. The fish I have out there are only at most 6 months old, and normally goldfish takes about until 3 years before they start breeding. That night, a couple of fry swam in front of the lights that I have on the pond, inside the pond, and were quickly gobbled up. And at first I thought it must be some sort of dragonfly nymph or something, but I pulled the female out, and as soon as I could set up the isolation tank, and within hours she delivered 3 more fry. I put 2 of them into what I call the wild pond thing, and so there was 1 in here, and I think I'm up to about 11 fry in here now. I'm a little concerned with the mother being in there with the fry running around. Fish aren't necessarily paternal, but they haven't seemed to be bothered. The mother has this big old large engorgement on one side of her body, and the only thing I can think of is, the eggs are developing inside of her, and she's giving birth to them as we go. Now, normally, here she is, right there. You can kind of see she just went over to the other side. I don't think I'm going to be able to show down through the pond what's going on, her very clearly on a day like today, but maybe sometime I'll see if I can get some good pictures of her. And like I said, I've got about 10, 11 new fry in this pond, this thing here, this tank here. And it was started with essentially tap water, let to sit a couple of days. And then I had gone down and gotten a sample, which is from my wild pond, which was about a quart of water that I'd scooped my net through a couple of times and got some duckweed and some water, and that all went into there, from which I picked out a couple of the red duckweed and the fern things, and there weren't very many. These have really grown quite a bit, but everything else in the wild pond tank has pretty much been left alone. It does have a few tadpoles. It has a couple of fry other than the goldfish fry that I put in there. There's probably 15 fry in that tank, and it's full of all sorts of creatures and spiders, and it's got a full pond life there. And that's what's going on. Stay tuned. I think I'm going to make a couple more of these pond life. I think following up on these would be good. At my particular location, which is approximately Vancouver, Washington, USA, we really don't get like a California or a Florida sun, so I didn't have high expectations, but certainly in the wild ponds around here, there's plenty of duckweed and plenty of interesting things going on. Stay tuned for my next one where I'll tell you about spending money for escargot for the local raccoons and how I solved the problem. Hang in there.